Thanks so much. A tiny title change. I'm going to talk about hearing differences, accidental lessons in listening. When I was about 13 years old, I spent an interesting afternoon with my best friend and his father, Mr. Joseph. My friend, I knew this family very well. My friend's mother was my violin teacher at the time, and he was an incredible violinist and went on to a professional career, and I did not. Mr. Joseph was the music director at a church near my house, and his job that day was to tune the church organ. He wedged a key down on a pipe that he knew to be in perfect pitch, and then he hit another key, which is the other pipe that needed to be tuned. These put out sound waves of almost exactly the same frequency, but not quite. And so he asked me to notice something. He said, listen for this warble, wavering sound the two are making together. About like that. Now, if this had been a guitar, he would have turned the tension on a string to get this pipe in right tune. But on an organ, there's a little slider at the base of the pipe. And he took a tiny hammer and he started to tap on the hammer to get that pipe attuned to the reference pipe. And as he did so, the warble slowed down. And a little slower. Until they almost vanished, and two sounds merged into one. The sound waves were coming out at just about the same frequency from both, and so most of the time they were in sync, but one would drift out and then drift back in sync, and that's what made those warbles in the air. So by this time, I'd been playing music for a few years, and I knew how to tune an instrument, and I knew I got a good feeling when the notes were in tune, and a little agitated feeling when they were out of tune. But until that day, I'd never really contemplated how fine the difference could be, or that there could be like physical evidence of it in the air. And too much is made of people you hear about perfect pitch, and other people will say, well, I'm tone deaf. And neither is really true. People do have absolute pitch. It's a clinical thing, but it doesn't help them become better musicians, and almost nobody is really tone deaf. Learning about pitch is one of the most fundamental differences you can appreciate in music and understand, and a good music education starts with pitch training, ear training, and it is as accessible to anybody as anybody else. It really starts with some early exposure and a little bit of practice. Now, a few years after that, as tends to happen, I was lured by the siren of rock and roll. Did I? No, that was not my sound. That was Bill Gates' sound, I think. Yes, lured by rock and roll, and in trying to put together a band in my high school, I took up the bass and found a bass teacher. However, we did that before the internet, and his name was Dennis, and he took me into his little musical lair, which was cool. I'd never seen a little recording studio before or a full-size bass rig, and he was a Beatles guy, 100%. He had Paul McCartney's Rickenbacker-style bass, and he had a Yellow Submarine poster on the wall, and he had a Beatles haircut circa 1966. And he was a great guy, and he taught me a lot. But the thing I think that I carried away that was most valuable to me was he taught me how to listen for individual parts in music.
What would you think if I sang out a tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me?
He wanted me to listen for just Paul McCartney's bass lines so we could transcribe them. And for me, this was weird because sound, music all came all at once. I had never thought about being able to tease it apart. But by the time he was done with me, I could make this track in my head sound a little like this. And we'd learn the bass line together. Now, I've since learned that when we listen to music, all of us break music up into component parts in our minds. If we couldn't, composers wouldn't have anything to do. We couldn't tell where the bass ended and the drums began. And the manipulation of these moving lines is what composers do. So it's an unconscious process. By the time it's back and you're appreciating it, the brain has reassembled them into a coherent whole that has impeccable timing and emotional impact. And we never need to think about consciously the individual parts. But there's a few people, there's a rare condition that you can read about in Oliver Sacks's book, Musicophilia, in which very few people actually do lack the circuitry or whatever to do the reassembling. They can identify the parts of a symphony, the strings, the woodwinds just fine. They can hear them, they make sense, but they never get the satisfaction of hearing them come back together again in an emotionally impactful whole. Listening to music post-Dennis it really changed my life. I can now hear and do intend to listen to the individual parts and the whole in a kind of dance, and it's really made listening more remarkable. This is also not hard. It begins with simply trying to identify the instruments on a record, not by looking at a band. That would be cheating. You want to use just your ears and say, and I had a friend with a son who he'd play it like a game. He'd put on a record and say, "What are you hearing?" And he would identify all the instruments. There's a fiddle, there's a banjo. And the kid was 3 years old. About the same time, I made a friend at school whose name was Gene, and Gene played the trumpet, and he was hip to jazz at an early age because his dad was hip to jazz. Jazz for me then was fascinating and totally intimidating, overwhelming in its scope. I didn't know where to start. And he gave me advice that turned out to be pretty common and good advice for somebody beginning a jazz journey. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. I would expect, and I dearly hope, that every one of you in this room has an album that opened a new door for you, that showed you something about music you never dreamed of before, and something about life. And for me, this was clearly one of those records. It ushered in questions that would transform my life and inform my work. What is jazz, and how does it relate to the blues? What is improvisation, and how is that even possible to play fluidly without making mistakes and make it up in real time? And how could music without words have so much meaning? So Kind of Blue was an epiphany, but it's not the epiphany I'm here to tell you about. No, Gene really blew my mind by telling me that there were people who listened to a lot of jazz who could identify a player simply by listening to 30 seconds of a solo. They could say, "That's probably John Coltrane, or Stan Getz, or Sonny Rollins." And in fact, this was John Coltrane, Stan Getz, and Sonny Rollins. And when you hear them side by side, you can hear differences in style and sound. But to a 15-year-old newcomer who hadn't started to tune up his ears or learn the history, these are just guys playing saxophone. Now, I'm not saying that this is easy. This is very hard, and I'm still on this journey. I would flunk the jazz saxophone blindfold test. But if you got me in a room, say, with a bunch of records by the great bluegrass guitar players, something I've studied as a player, I'd go into a blindfold test with some degree of confidence. The truth is, great instrumentalists do sound as unique as any human voice. We don't have any trouble telling Aretha Franklin from Eartha Kitt, for example. But when you think about an instrumentalist as a physical person with their own shape and size and a physical relationship with an instrument, which is itself unique and which they have chosen very carefully to be their expressive voice, you begin to realize that the potential is there, even if we can't do it every time. And if you fall in love with a particular player and listen to them over time, you notice the idiosyncrasies and the phrases and the ideas that make them as familiar as your friend's voice. The thing that breaks my heart a little bit is that I've heard many times in my life from people who are strangers to jazz about jazz is that it all sounds the same to them, which is the exact opposite of what it intends to be. It is an art form where individuals try to find that unique and distinctive voice amid a sea of incredible diversity. I moved to Nashville about 15 years ago and have had the privilege of reporting on music here in a professional music town, where I was able to then kind of ask questions and probe into areas of the music that had always puzzled me and that never really make it out into the general public discussion. And one of those things that I wanted to ask a lot of questions about was something called mastering. It's a part of the process of putting a record out, and it happens after the record has been recorded and then mixed, where the engineers put all the pieces in the right order and at the right relative volume, and they feel like, I've got a coherent record here. But a record company would never put out a record into the public at that stage. They would master it, even though 98% of the listening public or more would never notice that it hadn't been. They wouldn't call up and write letters and say, you didn't master my record. They would hardly know the difference. But so I'm going to put you in the seat of a client at the mastering house right now and let you hear the difference in real time. Indeed, at Independent Mastering, a company here in town that shared this recording with me, the before and the after, they have a little box with a red button, and you sit between speakers and you listen to the recording that you brought in, and then you toggle to the recording that they have made, and they have just tweaked a few little things to try to make it sound as good as possible. So this track, we're in the before here, before mastering. It's from the Wood Brothers, a record coming out soon on Southern Ground Artists. Thank you for let me play this. And listen for the cymbals, the bass, and the voice. I'm gonna have to catch up here. Hard for me to hear, I believe in that. Yeah. So I'll read you what the guy who did the work says about this, what his interpretation was. He wrote me, the difference between the before and the after for me is clarity. The bass is clearer. There's more space around the music, less mud. The percussion comes through. It's no longer covered. The vocal is present but not harsh. These were all things that were present in the mix, which they got into their shop, but that mastering brought out a little more. Now, mastering engineers are said to have exceptional ears, and I suppose that there are some people in the business, well, I know there are some, who definitely have especially acute hearing. They would score higher in a clinical test. But most people in the profession are people like you and me who simply were trained in the art of listening this way, of listening for those cues that lead them to think, I could make an improvement, and that they learn the tools to make those improvements. The takeaway from this is that these guys are working at a level that most of us would receive only subconsciously, but in music and in listening and in perception, there is that subconscious level to be dealt with, and it's vast. It's much more important to the emotional impact of the music and indeed long-term to our actual health than most of us are led to believe. So today I've told you about a few of my lessons in listening, and I call them accidental lessons because they weren't part of what little formal training I've had in music, my violin lessons, for example. They tended to come from people that I stumbled upon, people I was in conversation with, people who were in the business who shared a little insight with me here and there. And it made me realize that so much of acute listening and attentive listening comes from somebody telling you there was something to be heard to begin with, and you go, oh, yeah, now that you mention it. Before somebody told me there was enough information in a jazz saxophone solo to identify the player, it wouldn't have occurred to me to listen with the kind of attentiveness it would take to make that distinction. There's this book, famous book called The Soundscape by Murray Schafer, and there's a story in it of a gypsy violinist who took part in some research. He scored just great on all kinds of indicators of his perception of music and musical information, except for one conspicuous one, dynamics, loud versus soft. He seemed to have this mental block. It was odd. But it turned out it was cultural. The music that he'd bathed in all his life put almost no value on dynamics. They played at one volume, loud. And when he was offered a little bit of remedial training and sort of the cues to listen and how to react to that, his threshold for perception of dynamics rose to normal levels. I got to wonder, too, if he ever played the same way after that. Now, these kinds of insights tend to fall under the rubric of music appreciation, which is a term I don't really like because it implies that the insights involved only really help you in the world of listening to music, and I think that they go far, far deeper. I think that learning to listen actively and attentively is true brain training in a set of human capacities that I would put under the label discernment. The ability to critically hear things or perceive things that are below the surface, between the lines. the personal power of discernment is a kind of human quality that we hope to cultivate in ourselves and our kids. And it's the kind of thing that over your life could make the difference between choosing a positive or destructive social circle when you're young, or getting a good deal or getting ripped off, even finding the right life partner. Um, there is a there are tests that clinical psychologists have developed that attempt to measure empathy, the ability to respond and be aware of the subtle emotional changes in somebody with whom we're talking. And they discovered that in some cases, trained musicians scored higher than the general population on these empathy tests. Now, I realize this sounds potentially elitist. I'm not saying that musicians are better people than the general population, but is it really all that surprising that people who were carefully trained in the art of listening could be responsive, more responsive, or especially responsive to those subtle little vocal cues that would betray the emotional state of somebody else? And this has nothing to do with music. Given all this, I find it really frustrating or surprising that we don't, in our culture, make more use of music as a pathway to general cultural cohesiveness, enlightenment, call it what you will. It's an incredible tool, and yet music lessons are sort of pressed on young people as if they're some kind of vitamin supplement, and music in schools, as we know, has been treated more as a luxury that was expendable during tough times than a core thing. And all this has produced results. I would look at a society and say, how many adult musicians are there? People who grew up, and how, do music lessons make lifelong musicians? And we, I think, all know that they rarely do. Most stories end with, I quit at some time in my teens or in my 20s. I gave it up. I love to play almost every day, and I play guitar. Call me crazy, but I play guitar in Nashville. This is the most guitar-saturated town on earth. And I'm not a working player. I'm not a known player. I know I will never be a great player, but I do this because it is therapy for me. I can't imagine my life without it, and it's kind of continuing education. And there's things that I truly still want to accomplish and can see a pathway for the rest of my life, things I'd like to accomplish on the guitar. And I think I stuck with the practicing, the hard part, the learning curves, the plateaus, because of these lessons I've told you about today. They made the practicing more interesting. They made the rewards more comprehensible before I got there. So to conclude, I'm certainly not the first to say it. I'm definitely not the first to say it even in TED Talks, because this is a common theme. But listening, we live in a highly visual culture, and so we need to go out of our way to remind each other to just listen, to take delight and renewal and refreshment from pure sound. And we need to share this with our kids. I really do believe that if you want to make a profound difference in a young person's life, you can start by helping them hear the differences in the life that is around them. And thank you for listening to me. Appreciate it. 17 minutes. Thanks a lot.